3 days after my father passed away, I walked into our kitchen at mid-morning and found my husband lounging at the table in his sweatpants, sipping coffee. I stood frozen in the doorway, completely baffled by his presence on a busy Wednesday. At first, I foolishly thought he had taken bereavement leave to support me while I organized the funeral services. However, when I noticed his company phone missing from the counter, a sick feeling settled in my stomach. When I asked what was going on, he casually announced that he had resigned from his corporate job the previous afternoon. I stared at him in utter disbelief as he explained that he simply saw no reason to keep working when my father had left behind millions. My father had been gone for barely 72 hours, and his last voicemail was still saved on my phone because I could not bring myself to erase it. Sympathy cards were stacked near the toaster, yet my husband was sitting there acting as if he had just won the lottery. He knew my father had recently sold his mechanical business for a massive sum and assumed I was inheriting every penny. Without even asking me what the actual figures were or how I felt, he had calculated a comfortable retirement for himself based entirely on my father's hard work. When I confronted him about making such a massive decision without my input, he merely brushed off my anger and asked me not to create unnecessary drama during an already stressful week. The situation escalated that very evening when his mother and sister came over to bring us dinner. Within 20 minutes, my husband began casually distributing my expected inheritance to his family without my consent. He told his mother, Evelyn, that he would buy her a brand new house as soon as the funds cleared, and he promised his sister, Chloe, a gift of $200,000 to pay off her business debts. They both celebrated the news joyfully while I sat there completely ignored, feeling like a ghost in my own dining room. When I finally spoke up and reminded them that my father was not even in the ground yet, my husband scolded me for being rude to his family. The next morning, I received a call from my father's longtime family attorney, Arthur Vance, requesting a private meeting regarding the estate. When I mentioned that my husband would be joining me, Arthur hesitated and explicitly stated that my father had requested I come alone. Arriving at the law firm, I was met with shocking news that completely reframed my entire marriage. Arthur revealed that 8 months prior to his death, my husband had secretly approached my father multiple times to ask detailed questions about my future inheritance. My father had been so deeply unsettled by these encounters that he documented the entire conversation in a handwritten letter and instructed Arthur to safeguard my inheritance inside an independent corporate trust. Reading my father's blocky handwriting on those legal documents broke my heart into pieces. He wrote that while he cared for my husband, he refused to let my inheritance become a free ticket for someone else's premature retirement. The trust was structured so that for the first 5 years, no major distributions or large gifts could be made without the approval of an independent trustee. My father had intentionally built a financial barrier around me so that no one could manipulate or pressure me into making hasty financial decisions while I was grieving. Returning home that afternoon, I looked at my husband with entirely different eyes, realizing that his grand retirement plan had been set in motion long before my father ever fell ill. When I informed my husband about the restrictive trust structure, his calm demeanor completely vanished into panic and anger. He immediately demanded to know if we could borrow against the funds, realizing for the first time that his sudden resignation might leave him stranded without an income. That night, I overheard him whispering on the phone to his sister, reassuring her that he would find a way to make me come around to unlocking the money. Standing on the staircase in the dark, I realized I had spent 22 years giving in to his demands just to keep the peace. I decided right then that I was done playing the role of the quiet, compliant wife while my family treated my father's legacy like a personal piggy bank. Over the next few days, I discovered just how far my husband had gone behind my back. I found an email confirmation showing he had already placed a $5,000 deposit on a luxury lake house using our joint checking account. His mother had already notified her landlord that she would not be renewing her lease, and his sister had stopped negotiating her debt payments with creditors in anticipation of her payout. When I confronted him about changing other people's lives with money he did not own, he became furious and accused me of being selfish. He claimed there was no difference between my money and his money, revealing a deep-seated resentment he had harbored for years over my father's financial success. The tension reached a boiling point when Arthur called me back into his office to show me a document my father had kept. It was an 11-page business proposal titled The Miller Family Financial Projection, authored by my husband nearly a year before my father died. The document listed every single asset my father owned, mapped out my husband's retirement, allocated funds for Evelyn and Chloe, and detailed plans for luxury real estate. My name appeared dozens of times as the expected heir, yet there was not a single mention of what I wanted or needed for my own future. My husband had spent months orchestrating a fantasy life off my father's labor, treating me as nothing more than an account number. Armed with this realization, I instructed Arthur to ensure that not a single cent from the trust would ever enter our joint accounts. When I returned home and told my husband that I would not be requesting any funds for his mother's house, his sister's debt, or his lake home, his face turned pale with genuine fear. He realized that for the first time in 22 years, his usual charm and guilt trips were not going to work. Desperate, he tried calling his former employer to reclaim his position, only to be told that his job had already been offered to a junior colleague. The reality of his reckless gamble had finally caught up to him, leaving him completely unemployed and without access to my estate. In an effort to pressure me, my husband enlisted his family to intervene, leading to an uncomfortable confrontation in our living room. His sister expressed frustration over her lingering debts, while his mother tearfully spoke about her rising rent costs and her desire for stability. Despite my deep fondness for Evelyn, who had been a supportive presence during my daughter's birth and my mother's illness, I recognized that giving in would only validate my husband's entitlement. When Evelyn bluntly asked what I was saving the money for since my father could no longer use it, the boundary became crystal clear. I advised her to renew her current lease, realizing that my generosity could never be separated from my husband's arrogance. Even my daughter, Maya, called me later that evening after hearing a distorted version of the story from her father. She sounded torn and asked if I was really willing to end a 22-year marriage over money. I gently explained to her that this was not about the inheritance itself, but about the profound loss of respect and trust in my relationship. I refused to let her carry the burden of taking sides, but I made it clear that I was no longer willing to let her father make decisions for my life without my consent. That conversation was painful, but it solidified my resolve to stand firm against the manipulation that had quietly dominated my home for decades. That night, I grabbed my pillow and moved into the guest room, refusing to share a bed with a man who viewed me as an asset rather than a partner. In the weeks that followed, our home transformed into a cold, silent space of polite routine. My husband was forced to face the real-world consequences of his actions, calling former clients and attempting to explain his sudden departure from the industry. Slowly, he began taking tiny steps toward accountability, such as canceling the lake house reservation and telling his mother and sister that he had made promises he had no right to make. Hearing him admit to his family that the money was never his was a crucial turning point, though the damage had already been done. One Sunday afternoon, I sat my husband down at the kitchen table and laid out his 11-page financial proposal in front of him. Facing the physical evidence of his entitlement, he finally stopped arguing and broke down, confessing that he had always felt inadequate compared to my father's success. He admitted that he wanted to play the hero for his family and escape his own career exhaustion using my inheritance. While I felt a wave of sadness for his internal struggles, I also recognized that his personal insecurities did not give him the right to erase my voice. Seeing his deep remorse did not fix the past, but it allowed us to see the truth of our broken dynamic clearly for the very first time. Shortly after our daughter visited and saw the proposal for herself, I asked my husband to move out of the house so I could have space to think. He packed his belongings into his car and moved into a small rented apartment nearby without creating a dramatic scene. Locking the door behind him brought an overwhelming rush of mixed emotions, blending deep grief for the end of an era with a profound sense of relief. Living alone for the next few months was difficult, and I often missed his presence. But I recognized that missing someone does not mean you should sacrifice your self-respect to keep them close. During our separation, my husband secured a lower-paying sales job that required long hours and significant travel, facing his reality with quiet acceptance. Meanwhile, his family adapted to their original lives, managing their own expenses, and moving forward without the unearned windfall they had been promised. We eventually entered individual and couples counseling, where my husband finally acknowledged how often he had counted on my passivity to get his way. Although he made genuine efforts to change and repeatedly apologized for his behavior, I realized that I had outgrown the woman who was willing to quiet her own voice just to maintain a fragile peace. Eventually, I filed for a legal separation, which ultimately led to a mutual and respectful divorce process. My daughter and I spent weekends cleaning out my father's house, sharing fond memories and reflecting on the quiet wisdom he had embedded in his final wishes. Most of my inheritance remained safely invested, dedicated to securing my retirement, supporting future grandchildren, and funding local educational scholarships that my father had always cherished. On the day my husband and I signed our final divorce papers, we shared a quiet cup of coffee together, finally acknowledging that while the money had accelerated our downfall, the underlying issues had been present all along. Looking back, I realized that my father's true gift to me was not the millions resting in the trust, but the gift of time. That 5-year restriction gave me the essential space I needed to wake up from decades of compliance and evaluate my life with complete clarity. Without that protection, I likely would have backed down, handed over the money, and convinced myself that keeping everyone happy was the same thing as being a loving wife. Walking away from that marriage was the hardest decision I ever made, but it allowed me to finally retire from the exhausting job of pleasing others at the expense of my own worth.